who did ancient humans actually sleep with? And why does the answer break almost everything you assume about love? You've been taught that monogamy is natural, that marriage is ancient, that jealousy is just human nature. Almost none of that is true for 99% of human history, and the evidence is far stranger than fiction. For roughly 300 Zen years, humans lived in small bands where sex, partnership, and parenthood looked nothing like a wedding photo. There was no church, no government, no contract, no ring, and yet humans still formed bonds, raised children, and built families. So what did those relationships actually look like before institutions told us how love was supposed to work? Let's start with something that will sound impossible if you grew up believing in strict nuclear families. Among several hunter-gatherer cultures studied by anthropologists, multiple men were believed to contribute to a single child's conception. This belief is called partible paternity, and it exists among groups like the Ache in Paraguay and the Bari in Venezuela. In these cultures, a woman could have sexual relationships with several men during pregnancy, and each one was considered a partial biological father. That means a single child might have 2, 3, or even 5 men who all held responsibility for that child's survival. Anthropologist Stephen Beckerman studied the Bari people and found something remarkable about the children with multiple recognized fathers. Children who had more than one socially recognized father had significantly higher survival rates than children with only one. More fathers meant more men hunting for that child, more protection, more resources, more adults invested in keeping that one small life alive. This wasn't promiscuity for its own sake. It was a survival strategy disguised as intimacy, built directly into the social fabric of the tribe. Now compare that to your modern assumption that a child needs exactly one mother and one father, no more, no fewer, end of story. That assumption isn't biological law. It's a cultural script written by societies that came thousands of years after partible paternity already worked. But partible paternity is just one variation among an enormous range of family structures that existed across prehistoric human societies. Polyandry, where one woman has multiple husbands, existed among groups in the Himalayas, parts of Africa, and South America for practical reasons. In regions where resources were scarce and male mortality from hunting or conflict was high, polyandry helped ensure children always had enough protectors. Polygyny, where one man has multiple wives, was even more common historically, often appearing in resource-rich environments with social hierarchy. Anthropologists studying ethnographic records across hundreds of societies found that strict, lifelong monogamy was actually the rarer arrangement, not the default. So if monogamy wasn't universal, why does it feel so deeply natural, so obviously correct, so built into who we are as people? The answer is partly evolutionary and partly cultural, and untangling the two reveals something uncomfortable about how recently our current norms emerged. Evolutionary biologists point to one piece of physical evidence that complicates the simple monogamy story almost immediately. Human testicle size. Species that are strictly monogamous, like gibbons, tend to have small testicles relative to body size because there's no sperm competition between males. Species where females mate with multiple males, like chimpanzees, have evolved much larger testicles to compete directly inside the female reproductive system. Human testicle size sits right in the middle, larger than gibbons, but smaller than chimpanzees, suggesting a mixed mating system throughout our evolutionary history. This single physical detail tells researchers that our ancestors likely weren't strictly monogamous, but they also weren't living in pure chimpanzee-style promiscuity either. The truth seems to be something more flexible, more situational, shaped heavily by environment, resource availability, and the specific needs of each community. So let's reconstruct what intimacy and partnership might have actually looked like inside a typical hunter-gatherer band of 20 to 50 people. Pair bonds did form, two people who spent more time together, shared food preferentially, and raised children side by side most of the time. But these bonds were rarely as rigid, as exclusive, or as permanent as modern marriage, and they could shift as circumstances and feelings changed. Anthropologist Christopher Ryan, in his research on prehistoric sexuality, argued that early human sexual relationships were far more fluid than later agricultural societies. There was no concept of premarital virginity as a moral requirement, no dowry, no arranged contracts, no legal punishment for ending a relationship. If two people stopped wanting to be together, they simply stopped, and both typically remained fully embedded in the same supportive community regardless. Jealousy did exist, conflict did happen, but it operated differently than the possessive, ownership-based jealousy that defines so many modern relationship dynamics. Because survival depended on group cohesion rather than individual wealth accumulation, extreme possessiveness over a single partner could actually threaten everyone's safety. A man who created constant conflict by jealously guarding a single woman risked being excluded from hunting parties, food sharing, and social support entirely. Cooperation mattered more than control, and the entire social structure of these bands actively discouraged behavior that disrupted group harmony for personal possession. This doesn't mean prehistoric life was some kind of consequence-free utopia. Real tension, heartbreak, and conflict absolutely existed inside these communities. But the framework for handling those emotions was built around the group's survival, not around legal ownership of another person's body or loyalty. Children in these societies were rarely raised by just two parents working alone the way modern nuclear families typically operate today. Anthropologists call this pattern alloparenting, where multiple adults beyond the biological parents take direct responsibility for feeding, protecting, and teaching children. Grandmothers, aunts, uncles, older siblings, and even unrelated community members regularly fed, carried, and supervised children throughout an ordinary day. The hypothesis called the grandmother hypothesis suggests this is precisely why human females evolved to live decades past menopause. Unlike almost any other mammal, a grandmother who could no longer have children herself could instead dramatically increase the survival odds of her grandchildren by helping gather and protect them. This created entire support networks where a single child might be fed by 6 or 7 different adults throughout a single ordinary day. Compare that to the modern reality where 1 or 2 exhausted parents handle nearly everything alone, often without nearby extended family for support. What changed? The answer again traces back to the same turning point that reshaped nearly every other aspect of human life: agriculture. Once humans began farming roughly 10,000 years ago, land ownership became possible for the very first time in human history. And once land could be owned, inherited, and passed down, paternity certainty suddenly became economically critical in a way it never had been before. A man needed to know with certainty which children were biologically his, because his land, his cattle, and his wealth needed a clear, undisputed heir. This single shift in economic structure is what many anthropologists believe drove the rise of strict monogamy and intense control over female sexuality. Marriage transformed from a flexible social bond into a legal and economic contract designed primarily to protect inheritance and property, not romantic love. Religious institutions later reinforced and codified these rules, turning what began as economic necessity into moral and spiritual doctrine passed down for generations. By the time written history begins, the flexible, cooperative family structures of hunter-gatherer life had been almost completely replaced by rigid, ownership-based marriage systems. Women's sexuality, in particular, became something to be controlled, monitored, and legally restricted in ways that simply hadn't existed in earlier hunter-gatherer societies. Virginity became a measurable commodity, adultery became a punishable crime, and a woman's body became legally entangled with questions of property and inheritance. None of this existed in the same form among the Juhansi, the Hadza, or other societies that anthropologists have studied as windows into our deeper past. So when you look at modern dating, modern marriage, modern jealousy, and modern heartbreak, you're not looking at unchangeable human nature. You're looking at roughly 10,000 years of agricultural and religious history layered on top of 300,000 years of something far more fluid. That doesn't mean monogamy is wrong, unnatural, or something to abandon. Humans clearly are capable of deep, lasting, exclusive pair bonds too. What it means is that the rigid, jealous, possession-based version of love many people assume is biologically inevitable is actually a relatively recent invention. Our ancestors built families out of cooperation, shared responsibility, and flexible bonds shaped by survival, not out of legal contracts and inherited property rights. A child wasn't just the responsibility of two exhausted parents. An entire community quietly agreed to keep that one small life alive together. Partners didn't need permanent ownership over each other to feel connected because the entire social structure rewarded cooperation over control at every level. And perhaps most strikingly, the absence of rigid rules didn't create chaos. It created some of the most cooperative, low-conflict societies ever studied. Modern researchers studying remaining hunter-gatherer societies consistently report remarkably low rates of long-term resentment, possessive violence, and the kind of jealousy-driven conflict common today. This doesn't mean ancient life was perfect or without pain, heartbreak, grief, or difficult relationships between people who simply didn't get along. But the underlying structure, the safety net of multiple caregivers, multiple potential partners, and community-wide responsibility softened many of the sharpest edges of human conflict. When a relationship ended, there was no custody battle, no division of property, no legal system designed to punish one party over the other. The community simply absorbed the shift. Children continued to be fed by aunts and grandmothers and neighbors, and life continued without total collapse. Compare that to the isolation many modern parents feel, raising children largely alone, without an extended network of adults sharing the daily load. Compare that to the anxiety surrounding modern relationships, where a single partner is expected to fulfill nearly every emotional, sexual, and practical need alone. Our ancestors didn't carry that singular burden because love, partnership, and parenting were distributed across an entire interconnected community of people. This is not a call to abandon modern relationships or commitment, but it is a reminder that much of what feels biologically fixed is actually historically recent. The need for connection is ancient, real, and deeply human, but the specific rules we've built around it are far younger than most people assume. Marriage as a legal, exclusive, property-protecting institution is barely a blip in the long timeline of how humans have actually loved and raised each other. For most of our existence, love looked like a village raising a child together, not two isolated people trying to do everything entirely alone. Understanding this doesn't erase your own relationships or invalidate modern marriage, but it does offer a different lens for understanding where your instincts actually come from. The jealousy you feel, the loneliness of modern parenting, the pressure of finding one perfect partner who meets every single need, these are recent inventions. Your ancestors solved the problem of love and survival differently, through cooperation rather than ownership, through community rather than isolation, through flexibility rather than rigid rules. And for roughly 300,000 years, that system worked well enough to keep an entire species alive, connected, and remarkably free of the relationship anxieties so common today.